Reddit. What's the creepiest act of kindness you've ever witnessed? The hospital stood like a monolith at the edge of town, a towering repository of whirring machinery, flickering fluorescent lights, and antiseptic whispers. It was a place where time bled slowly, where each ticking second seemed to echo against the cold linoleum like a heartbeat reluctant to go on. The walls were painted in shades of weary gray, the kind that bled all warmth from the eyes and sucked the color from memory. Room 304 lay tucked into the far wing, near the windowless corridor that nurses passed quickly and only when they had to. It was the sort of room that gathered dust in the corners and invited a silence that didn't merely sit, it weighed. The man who lay in that bed had no name that anyone remembered. A John Doe scribbled in a file thick with neglect and coffee stains, his face an amalgamation of sagging skin, brittle veins, and a skull that looked too big for his frame. He came in after a fall. Some say he was found collapsed outside a church, others whispered about a shelter downtown. But what mattered was that no one came for him. Days stretched into weeks, and the light behind his eyes seemed to recede like the tide, pulling further from shore each time a nurse came in to check the monitors that beeped only to break the silence. The nurses pitied him in the way you pity a broken clock, useless, but tragic, because once it had a purpose. Then she came. The first to notice her was Nurse Lyle, a heavy-set woman with arthritis in both knees and a voice like sandpaper rubbed against a prayer book. She didn't hear the elevator ding, didn't catch a name in the log. But when she did her rounds that night, room 304 wasn't empty. There she was, sitting at the man's bedside like a portrait from another era. Dressed in a black coat too long for her small frame, gloved hands resting motionless in her lap, and a cascade of ink-dark hair that shimmered faintly even in the dimness. Her face, though partially shadowed, seemed to tilt toward the dying man with a reverence too intimate to be casual. No one had let her in. No one ever saw her enter. She would simply appear, just as the last embers of sun vanished behind the frostbitten horizon. Always with a bouquet of flowers clutched in one hand, white, crimson, and a violet so dark it nearly vanished into itself. The petals never matched the season. Chrysanthemums bloomed in January, hydrangeas in the frost, lilies with no scent. Flowers that should have withered in the cold but remained immaculate, as though cut from some untouched garden where decay dared not bloom. She never spoke. Not to the staff, not to the patients, not even in acknowledgement when Lyle or Ramesh or any of the night nurses would shuffle by, trying not to stare too long. But inside room 304, they said she would lean close to the old man's ear and whisper. Not words they could hear, but syllables too soft, too strange, like a lullaby sung in a language meant only for the dying. She would stroke his hair, once tangled and dull, now combed with inexplicable care, as if she coaxed each strand into remembering life. Some tried to confront her. Security guards pulled up footage but found nothing. Cameras outside 304 blinked uselessly, looping the same 3 frames each time she visited. Static, empty hall, a flicker, and then nothing. One guard swore he followed her shadow down the corridor, but turned the corner to find only the scent of jasmine and a lingering cold that slipped beneath his clothes and made him forget why he was afraid. And then came the night with the razor. It was a storm-lashed evening, thunder muffled by the insulated glass and wind howling like a choir of grieving widows. Power flickered, just long enough for the hallway lights to stutter, and then settle into dimness. Lyle and Ramesh were on shift again, their footsteps careful, their voices quieter than usual. When they reached 304, the door stood ajar, something that never happened. Inside, she sat as always, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a strange reverence in her stillness, an expectant hush that made Lyle's chest tighten. The flowers lay at the foot of the bed, and in her hand, delicate and gleaming, was the blade. Not a utility razor or something surgical, but an ornate thing, antique and curved, with a handle of bone and etchings in a language no one could name. She held it to the old man's wrist, not with cruelty, not with hesitation, but like a ritual, as if the flesh was a lock and she alone held the key. The blade moved. There was no resistance, no scream, no tension in the air, just the soft exhale of a final breath and the subtlest smile forming on the man's lips. Peaceful, undeniably so, a serenity so foreign to this place it almost felt obscene. When the nurses burst in, lights snapping to full brightness, There was no blood, no blade, no woman. Only the scent of jasmine growing thicker now as if poured into the room. The man lay lifeless but at ease, as though he had died remembering something beautiful. They searched. Nothing. They reviewed the cameras again. Static. 3 frames. No sign of her. No one could explain the flowers that never wilted, nor why, on each full moon, fresh ones would appear. Always the same colors, always arranged with unnatural precision. Room 304 was eventually closed, and yet the door was found unlocked every month, flowers placed at the foot of an empty bed that hadn't held a patient in over a year. No one mentions her now. New nurses are warned not to ask, but the old ones, those who remember the chill that accompanied her presence and the strange solace that clung to her absence, they never forget. And in the hush that falls across the hospital during the witching hour, when machines hum like morning choirs, and even time seems afraid to move forward, the scent of jasmine creeps into the vents, and shadows lengthen in the corners of room 304. Because sometimes kindness doesn't heal. Sometimes it delivers you softly into something far, far worse than death. Long after the incident in room 304 had been swept beneath layers of bureaucratic silence and whispered hospital superstition, the ward carried a breathless unease, like a wound that refused to close. The staff never spoke of her by name, mostly because they never had one to use. The visitor, they sometimes muttered in the break room over cold coffee and 2 sweet pastries, but even that phrase was rarely spoken above a murmur. Room 304 had been stripped clean, of linens, of equipment, even of its door number. It was officially unlisted now, a blank anomaly on the floor plan, its vacancy guarded not by policy but by the fear no one was willing to admit they believed in. Yet every month, precisely at the stroke of midnight when the full moon hung swollen and pale in the sky like a milky eye, the door would creak open of its own accord, and the flowers would appear again. And then came the man with the petals for eyes. He was brought in through the emergency wing during an early autumn rain, the kind of storm that seemed to slough the skin off the sky and smear it across the horizon. Paramedics found him wandering along Route 17, barefoot and dressed in what looked like ceremonial robes, stitched from yellowed silk and strands of faded parchment. No ID, no shoes, no sign of injury, just silent, with the faintest smile carving itself along his cracked lips. And those eyes, if they could be called that. They weren't eyes in the human sense. Nestled where the pupils should be were twin clusters of flower petals, deep crimson and impossibly moist, as though freshly plucked from a garden that shouldn't exist. The petals shifted, as if alive, like the wings of slumbering moths, twitching beneath closed lids. The staff dubbed him Petal when they needed to refer to him in conversation, mostly to avoid saying the man in 311 with no eyes, a phrase that never sat comfortably on the tongue. He didn't speak, but he watched, or rather, gave the distinct impression of watching. People said standing in his presence felt like being studied by something old and immense, something polite only because it had no reason to be cruel. Yet. The nurses rotated care assignments to avoid spending too much time in his room, though none could explain why. He was never violent. He never moved unless being moved. His pulse was steady, his breathing soft. Still, he radiated a presence that reminded them of a still pond that might conceal the mouth of something unspeakable beneath the surface. Stranger still was his connection to room 304. Whenever the door to that forsaken room creaked open, always at midnight, always without prompting, Petal's head would turn, regardless of sedation, regardless of restraint. And in those moments, the petals in his sockets would begin to tremble, opening just slightly, revealing beneath them a glistening darkness that made seasoned nurses forget what they were doing and turn abruptly down other hallways. Then, one night, room 304 did not open at midnight. The moon hung swollen as ever in the sky, pressing its pale light through the cloud glass windows, but the door remained shut. The nurses, those still brave enough to be on shift, shared tense glances as the clock ticked past 12. Lyle had returned after a month's, drawn back by some invisible thread of morbid loyalty. Ramesh had tried to retire but couldn't sleep anymore outside the hospital, plagued by dreams of black hair brushing his cheek and whispers he could almost understand. At 12:17 a.m., a shrill, high-frequency tone erupted from room 311. When they rushed in, Petal was standing. No one had ever seen him upright before. He faced the window, hands clasped behind his back in an eerily composed posture, as though waiting for someone. The petals had peeled open entirely now, exposing an absence so deep it seemed to drink the light. The room itself had grown cold, breath-steaming cold, though the thermostat remained steady. He turned toward the nurses slowly, his expression blank, and then extended his hand. In his palm was a single violet bloom, identical to those in the bouquets that appeared in 304 every month. It pulsed, as if breathing. Ramesh took a step back. Lyle stared, her breath trembling. Where did you get that?" she asked, though her voice cracked in the middle like a snapped branch. Petal said nothing. He stepped forward, and the lights in the hallway behind him blinked out one by one. Not flickered, extinguished, as if something were swallowing the electricity, or the very concept of illumination. He moved with eerie precision, like a marionette mimicking human grace. With every footstep, the floor seemed to hum beneath him, a vibration too subtle to be measured but impossible to ignore. As he reached room 304, the door finally opened. No one had touched it. No key was used. No mechanism triggered. It simply yawned inward, revealing the untouched interior, perfectly preserved, as though time refused to touch it. The bed had been made, the sheets tucked so tight they could have been ironed by ghosts. The air inside smelled of jasmine and old soil. Petal stepped through the doorway, and as he did, every monitor on the floor spiked with static before going flatline in unison. The lights died. Darkness took the ward in one clean swallow, and for a moment there was only silence, deep and absolute. Then, in the quiet, a sound began. Not a scream, not a mechanical alarm, but a low, resonant humming, female in tone, lilting and mournful, like an elegy sung for bones too old to bury. It reverberated through the halls, winding its way into the ears of every living thing in the building. Nurses dropped their clipboards. Doctors froze mid-sentence. One patient, recovering from surgery 3 doors down, began to sob uncontrollably without knowing why. When the lights flickered back on, room 304 was empty again. Petal was gone. No footprints. No trace. Just a fresh bouquet at the bedside and the faint imprint of someone having sat on the mattress. After that night, things in the hospital changed. Some staff began reporting dreams, always of gardens, vast and overgrown, lit by moons of unnatural hue. In those dreams, Petals whispered secrets to them, secrets that unraveled their minds until they woke up screaming, their eyes watering with the scent of jasmine still thick in their throats. Others claimed to see the visitor in their periphery, in reflections that didn't quite match, in windows that showed no landscape, but an endless orchard under a twilight that never shifted. And every month, the flowers still came. But now, there were more of them. Winter came hard that year, the kind of winter that carved its name into the bones of the city and turned every breath into a ghost. Snow fell in a way that didn't feel quite natural, too silent, too persistent, too heavy, like the sky was trying to smother something buried underneath. The hospital's power flickered regularly now, even when the weather was calm. The air vents whispered at night, sighing soft sounds that mimicked voices. No one ever heard them clearly, but the tones always left the skin crawling, and in room 304, the impossible bouquets kept appearing, though the door now remained sealed with steel bolts and holy symbols chalked in secret by terrified janitors after hours. It wasn't enough. The hospital had become a place where reality thinned. Patients wandered at night, murmuring names they'd never known. One woman in the coma ward opened her eyes just long enough to say, "She's close now," before falling back into her endless sleep. Staff began to vanish. First a young intern, then a nurse named Howard, both last seen in the vicinity of the East Wing near room 304. No blood, no bodies, just missing. The hospital administration sent investigators, but the reports returned sealed, unreadable, redacted into meaningless strings of disconnected words. Officially, nothing was happening. Unofficially, every person in the building lived in a state of quiet dread, as if waiting for an overdue knock at the door. It came on the last full moon of the year. Lyle had retired weeks earlier, claiming her dreams had started bleeding into the waking world. She left behind a diary, most of it incoherent scribbles and frantic warnings, but in the final pages, one phrase repeated over and over again. Don't look in the mirror when the flowers bloom. Ramesh stayed. Something in him had broken and rebuilt itself differently since the night Petal disappeared into room 304. He walked the halls without expression now, clocking in and out like a ghost wearing a man's skin. His co-workers avoided him when they could, not out of malice but instinct. At midnight, every door in the hospital opened at once. Not slammed, not creaked, just eased open in one simultaneous gesture, like the entire building had exhaled. The emergency generators buzzed into activity, even though the power hadn't failed. Screens glowed static white. IVs began to drip black fluid. The flowers that had once been confined to room 304 now blossomed throughout the corridors, on the ceilings, sprouting from vents, coiled tightly around doorknobs. The hospital floor tiles cracked open with fine seams, and from beneath them, roots slithered out like veins seeking a heartbeat. And then she came back. The visitor, unchanged. Her long black coat trailed behind her as if stitched from shadow. Her gloves were gone now, her hands pale and long-fingered, tipped with nails so fine they looked like obsidian needles. Her eyes were pools of still water in which stars had drowned. She moved with a grace that made reality flicker in her wake. Monitors glitched when she passed, clocks reversed, reflections turned their heads before their mirrored counterparts did. She headed straight for room 304, and the doors, no longer resisting, simply opened ahead of her like a path being offered. Inside the room was the old bed, now weathered and sunken, the mattress sagging like an exhausted lung. Beside it stood Petal, dressed in the same tattered robes, his petal eyes closed. He held a bouquet not of flowers, but of hands, severed, preserved, each still clutching something invisible, each belonging to someone once lost in the hospital's whispers. He offered it to her without ceremony. She accepted. And then she turned to face the world outside the room. From every corridor, every doorway, people watched. Patients, nurses, doctors, orderlies. No one moved. The building had stilled, caught in the gravitational pull of her presence. And when she spoke, her voice was not a sound, but a memory, one you forgot having yet recognized in your marrow. "You have made this place a prison," she said, and the walls wept mildew. But it was always a seed. She raised her hand, and the ceiling above cracked in a spiral. Through it, not the night sky, but a garden descended. A vast expanse of twisting vines, enormous black lilies, and trees with lungs instead of leaves. The roots burrowed into the hospital, entwining every wall, every stairwell, every life. As they grew, time unraveled. Years folded inwards. Moments dissolved. Machines blinked out, not broken, but irrelevant. The structure no longer resembled a hospital. It was a cathedral now, a sanctuary made not of prayer, but of surrender. She moved among them, her steps soundless, her presence overwhelming. Where she touched, pain ceased. Where she looked, memories emptied. And the people, one by one, followed her, not in fear, not in joy, but in a dazed recognition, like pilgrims returning to the only home they had never known. Petal was the last. He stood at the threshold of room 304, petals now falling from his eyes like tears. He looked once behind him, toward the hallway where the real world used to be. Then he stepped into the garden, and the door closed. It never opened again. Days passed, or seemed to. The hospital was condemned. Workers sent to clear the site found nothing, just vines and dust and echoes that didn't belong. Room 304 no longer appeared on any blueprints. No one remembered who built it. No one remembered the old man. No one remembered the visitor. Except sometimes, in the quietest hours, in hospitals far away, a nurse will pass by a room and stop, unsettled by the scent of jasmine. The door may be unnumbered. The room may appear empty. But inside, on the bed, a single violet flower waits, impossibly fresh. And somewhere beyond the veil, in a garden that feeds on memory and breathes through the roots of forgotten places, she walks among her collection of the lost, not cruel, not kind, just eternal, and always waiting.